The arrow took the bark off the tree an inch from Benjamin Turner's ear, and he was still trying to understand that fact when the second one struck the man beside him in the shoulder and knocked him screaming into the mud. "Down! Everyone down!" Benjamin shouted, though he had no authority to shout anything, being just a dockhand and shipwright's apprentice who had wandered further from salt water than he had ever intended in his life. Around him, the logging crew scattered between the felled trunks of the thornwood reach, axes and saws abandoned, while shapes moved in the green dark between the trees, masked in orc-style hide but moving wrong, moving like men who had learned orc war paint from rumor rather than truth. Benjamin dragged the wounded man behind a stripped log, pressing a torn strip of his own shirt against the wound, and it was in that moment, with blood on his hands and arrows hissing through ferns, that he heard the horn. It was not a human horn. It came from deeper in the trees, low and long and full of a fury that made the birds go silent, and a heartbeat later the masked raiders were no longer shooting at the logging camp. They were running from something. She came through the underbrush like the forest itself had decided to stand up and fight. Benjamin had heard the stories in Saltmore Cove's taverns. Sailors talk of orc women, 7 feet of muscle and menace, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of Kasha Mudborn crashing into the clearing with a curved blade in each hand, her dark green skin slicked with sweat, black hair bound back in a warrior's braid, and an expression that promised the raiders would not enjoy what came next. She did not slow down. She took the nearest masked man by the collar of his stolen furs, swept his legs from beneath him with a motion too fast for Benjamin's eye to follow, and put a boot on his chest hard enough that Benjamin heard the breath leave his body from 30 feet away. "Who sent you?" she said, and her voice, low and cutting, carried over the clearing like a blade drawn across stone. "Answer, or I feed you to the river." The man did not answer. He tried to roll away, and she let him, watching with open contempt as he and his companions fled crashing through the brush, abandoning 2 of their own who lay groaning in the mud. She did not chase them. She turned instead, blade still in hand, and looked over the ruined camp, the frightened crew, the felled ironwood logs scattered like the bones of some great beast, and finally she looked at Benjamin, kneeling in the dirt with his hands pressed red against a stranger's shoulder. For a moment neither of them moved. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing gentle in it, all long hard lines and quiet power, clad in fitted travel leathers laced tight at the waist and reinforced at the shoulder with plates of dark bronze, a warrior's garb cut close to a figure that had clearly never needed anyone's protection. Her tusks were small, more felt in her voice than seen, and her eyes, when they found his, were a startling amber gold. "You," she said, "you did not run." "Wasn't going to leave him bleeding," Benjamin said, nodding down at the wounded man whose name was Tam, a rope handler who had never done anything to deserve an arrow. Didn't seem right. Kasha crossed the clearing in 4 strides and crouched beside them, and up close Benjamin could smell wood smoke and crushed pine on her, could see the fine scars along her forearms that told a longer story than she likely wanted told. She examined the wound with quick, competent fingers, then reached to her belt and produced a small clay jar. "Hold him still," she said, and packed a dark paste into the wound before Tam could protest, and the man's screaming dropped to a whimper and then, astonishingly, to nothing at all as whatever was in the jar did its work. "What is that?" Benjamin asked. "Something you would not have," she said, not unkindly, "if my clan did not still honor the old treaty, which is more than I can say for the men who did this." Her golden eyes narrowed on the 2 moaning raiders left behind, and she studied their masks, their gear, with the eye of someone building a case rather than simply feeling rage. "These are not Mudborn. These are not orc kin of any clan I know. Human hands beneath orc paint to make you believe otherwise. Why would anyone want us to think it was your people?" "Because a broken treaty means a broken border," Kasha said, standing, wiping her blade clean on the grass with a motion so casual it made the violence of moments before feel like something already half a memory. And a broken border means men with axes come further into Mudborn land than any treaty allows, and no one asks who started it. She looked at him again, longer this time, as if reconsidering something. You are not one of the usual timber men. You smell of tar and salt water, not pine sap. Shipwright, Benjamin admitted, from Saltmore Cove down the coast. My master sent me inland to see about a contract, ironwood for hulls, since ordinary oak keeps splitting on the northern crossings. I've never held an axe in my life before this month, if you want the truth of it. Something in her face shifted, not quite a smile, but an easing, the corner of her mouth losing some of its hard set. A man out of his element. Story of my life, Benjamin said, and meant it more than he intended to say aloud. Kasha Mudborn looked down at him a moment longer, at the blood on his hands, the torn shirt, the stubborn set of his jaw even as his voice shook faintly with the aftermath of terror, and something settled behind her eyes like a decision being filed away for later use. I'm posted to this border, shipwright, she said. By treaty and by my clan chief's word, I answer for what happens in these woods. From this day I will be watching your camp more closely than before. Do not mistake it for softness. Wouldn't dream of it, Benjamin said, and for the first time since the arrows had started flying, he found himself almost smiling. She left before the other crewmen worked up the courage to approach, melting back into the tree line as easily as she had appeared, and it was only after she was gone that Benjamin realized his hands were still shaking, and not entirely from fear. The camp foreman, a heavy-set man named Garrick Hale, found his voice once the orc woman was well and truly gone. Ought to have let her walk on by, he muttered, spitting into the mud. Bringing more of her kind sniffing round our stores. Bad enough dealing with the whole cursed treaty, without one of them deciding she owns the ground we're standing on. She saved our lives, Garrick, Benjamin said, helping Tam to his feet, the man's shoulder already bound and astonishingly barely bleeding. She saved her own treaty, Garrick said. Don't mistake it for charity, boy. Benjamin said nothing further, but that night, lying on his bedroll under canvas with the forest breathing around him, and the memory of amber eyes still bright behind his own closed lids, he found he did not agree. The Thornwood Reach stretched for miles along the border of Mudborn land, a deep old forest of towering ironwood trees whose black-grained timber was prized from one end of the coast to the other, strong enough to turn a hull that would shatter oak in half against northern ice. The treaty that allowed the Colborne Timber Company to harvest there was older than Benjamin, older than his father, hammered out after a war neither side wished to repeat, and it survived now on a thin, careful trust. Humans logged only the marked boundary trees, paid tribute in iron and cloth and salted fish for the privilege, and Mudborn warriors patrolled to see the terms were kept. It was a peace built on the memory of blood, and everyone in camp knew it could crack like river ice if the wrong stone were thrown. Benjamin had come inland on his master's orders, carrying letters of credit and a contract to be signed, expecting to spend a fortnight overseeing the first shipment, and then return to Saltmore Cove and the familiar creak of the dry docks, the smell of tar and salt, the quiet, solitary life he had built there since his father passed and left him the tools and the debts both. He had not expected an ambush. He certainly had not expected to spend the following morning being escorted, at Kasha Mudborn's insistence, along the treaty boundary so that she might show him with her own hands where the false raiders had crossed from beyond Mudborn patrol lines. Here, she said, crouching at the edge of a game trail, tracing a boot print in the soft earth. Human boots, human stride, but see how they tried to drag branches to hide the trail. Sloppy. My scouts would have seen it in a breath, but your company men would not know a true orc raiding party from a herd of spooked deer. I wouldn't either, Benjamin admitted, crouching beside her, close enough to catch the scent of crushed cedar that seemed to follow her. I build ships. I know the grain of good wood and the pitch of a proper hull and not much else. Then why did you not run, shipwright, when the arrows came? He considered the question honestly, because she seemed the sort of woman who could smell a false answer at 20 paces. There wasn't time to think about running. Tam was on the ground, and nobody else was moving to help him. Seemed simpler to just do the thing in front of me. Kasha studied him with that same weighing look she'd given him in the clearing, gold eyes narrowed against the dappled light. In my clan we have a saying, a man's worth is not what he claims when the fire is warm, but what his hands do when the fire is at his throat. You did not know I was watching. You did not perform courage for an audience. That is rarer than you might think, among men who come into our woods. High praise from someone who was busy putting her boot through a man's ribs at the time. That earned him something close to a laugh, a short huffed breath through her nose. Careful, shipwright. Flattery from a human is usually followed by a request. No request, Benjamin said. Just gratitude, and maybe curiosity. I've never spoken with an orc before yesterday. Didn't expect one to save my life and then walk me through her forest like she's showing off a garden. I am not showing off, Kasha said, straightening. I am teaching you to see, so that the next time false raiders try to burn my people's peace for their own profit, your camp will know the difference between a mudborn arrow and a coward's imitation. She paused, then added, with a faint curl at the edge of her mouth that he was beginning to recognize as her particular flavor of humor. Though if you wish to call it a garden, I will not stop you. It is prettier than your camp, at least. Can't argue with that, Benjamin said, glancing back through the trees toward the smoke of the cookfires and the sound of axes ringing against ironwood trunks. Though I should tell you, where I'm from, showing a stranger your garden is generally considered a fair sign you like them. Kasha's eyes cut to him, sharp and assessing, and for a moment he wondered if he'd overstepped some invisible line between courtesy and impertinence. Then she said, evenly, "Then it is fortunate I am not from where you are from," and turned to walk deeper into the trees, though he thought, watching her go, that there had been the faintest color rising along the green of her throat. She was gone 3 days after that, called back to the war camp on some matter of clan business, and Benjamin found the thornwood reach a duller place without her. The felling and hauling and the constant low friction between Garrick's crew and the memory of orc steel, a poor substitute for the quick, dangerous conversations he'd begun to look forward to more than he wanted to admit. When she returned, it was with a proposal that startled the entire camp. Her clan chief, weighing the ambush and the fragile treaty, had ordered a permanent mudborn warden stationed at the logging camp itself, to live among the humans through the felling season and ensure no further false raids could be blamed on her people. Kasha Mudborn had volunteered for the post herself. Over, Benjamin later learned, the objections of at least 2 clan elders who thought it beneath a warrior of her standing to live among tree thieves, as some of the older Mudborn still called the timber crews. You volunteered, Benjamin said, the evening she arrived to make camp on the treaty side of the boundary line, close enough to the human tents that Garrick's face had gone the color of old ash when he heard the news. I did. Any particular reason? Kasha was busy driving stakes for her own small shelter, a task she performed with brisk, economical strength that made the mallet look like a toy in her hand. Someone with sense needs to watch this camp, she said, not looking up. The false raiders will try again. A liar rarely stops at one lie. That's the only reason. She glanced at him sidelong, and there it was again, that faint curve at the corner of her mouth. Perhaps I also grew tired of hearing my scouts describe a shipwright who does not know one end of an axe from the other, and insists on trying to help fell ironwood regardless. I'm getting better, Benjamin protested. You are getting closer to losing a foot, Kasha said, which is not the same thing, and she drove the last stake home with a single blow that made the whole frame of her shelter shudder into place. It was that same week, watching her show a pair of nervous crewmen the proper way to notch a trunk so it fell true instead of splitting, that Benjamin first proposed the game that would, before the season's end, cost them both a great deal of careful pride. I'll bet you, he said during the midday rest, when the crew scattered to eat cold bread and salted fish along the riverbank and Kasha sat apart from them as she always did, sharpening a blade that did not particularly need sharpening, that I can put an axe through that stump in one blow before you can knock and loose 3 arrows into it. Kasha looked at the stump in question, a wide old ironwood remnant near the water, then at him with open skepticism. You would lose. Probably, Benjamin agreed cheerfully. But if I win, you have to tell me one true thing about yourself, something you wouldn't tell just anyone. Her brows rose, surprise flickering plainly across her face before she mastered it. And if I win, then I have to do the same, one true thing, whatever you ask. She considered him for a long moment, turning the whetstone over once in her palm, and he understood, watching her, that she was not merely weighing the terms of a foolish wager but something else entirely, some old habit of wariness deciding whether it was safe to be curious about a human man at all. Very well, shipwright, she said finally, but do not cry to me when you have embedded that axe in your own boot. He lost, spectacularly, the axe skipping sideways off the stump and burying itself in the riverbank mud, while Kasha put 3 arrows through the same knot of wood in the time it took him to recover his balance, and the crew who had gathered to watch roared with laughter that was, for once, not unkind. He paid his forfeit that evening, sitting across the fire from her while the rest of the camp slept, and told her about his father, about the drowning that had taken him off the Saltmore breakwater 3 winters past, about how Benjamin had kept the shipyard running alone since, how the other shipwrights in town treated him kindly enough but always at arm's length, as though grief were something catching. Kasha listened without interrupting, firelight moving gold across the plains of her face, and when he finished she was quiet a moment before she said, "You do not sound like a man who expects to be missed if he does not return from these woods." "Didn't think about it that way," Benjamin admitted. "But no, suppose I don't." "That is a poor way to live," Kasha said, and there was something almost gentle in the roughness of her voice. "A man should know he is missed. Is that your one true thing?" he asked, half teasing, trying to shift the sudden weight in his chest. "Orc wisdom free of charge." "No," she said. "That was only an observation. If you win again, I will tell you something true. Until then, save your questions, shipwright. I do not give away my secrets so cheaply as that." But she gave them away, over the following weeks, more readily than either of them admitted aloud, one dare and one forfeit at a time. He dared her to eat the ship's biscuit the crew subsisted on, and watched her nearly break a tooth on it, laughing despite the pain in a way that made something in his chest turn over entirely. She dared him to swim the cold river at dawn and stood on the bank afterward, arms crossed, trying and failing to hide her grin at his gasping, shivering emergence. He dared her to let him braid a strand of her hair, clumsy and slow, his fingers unused to the work, and she sat still and silent through the whole ordeal with a stillness he came to understand was its own kind of trust, since Mudborn warriors did not let blades near their hair without absolute confidence in the hand that held them. She dared him, in turn, to climb the tallest standing ironwood at the camp's edge, and he did badly, scraping both palms raw, and came down to find her waiting at the base of the tree with an expression that was trying very hard to be stern and failing utterly. Each dare pulled a truth loose. He learned that Kasha Mudborn's mother had died defending the very border they now stood on, in the war before the treaty, and that Kasha had been raised half by her aunt and half by the whetstone and the bow, that she had never once in her life been asked to be gentle and had stopped, long ago, expecting anyone to want her to be. She learned that Benjamin had never once been chosen first for anything in his life, not by his father's trade, which he'd inherited rather than been given, not by the town girls who found a quiet dockhand less interesting than a merchant's son, not even, some nights he did not say aloud, by his own sense that he mattered enough to be sought after rather than simply tolerated. "They do not deserve you," Kasha said once low when he admitted as much, and the sudden ferocity in her voice startled him more than any arrow had. "You don't know that," Benjamin said. "You've known me a month." "I know enough," Kasha said. "I have led war parties, shipwright." I know how to judge a man's worth in less time than that." She looked away into the fire, jaw tight, as if she had said more than she intended, and it was 3 days before either of them raised another dare between them, though the air had changed, charged now with something neither could pretend not to notice. The company's quartermaster, a thin, ink-stained man named Aldous Pike who kept the treaty ledgers and handled the tribute payments to the Mudborn envoys, watched all of this with narrow, calculating eyes that Benjamin, absorbed as he was, did not think to question. Pike had been with the Colborne Company for years, trusted with the treaty's delicate accounting, and no one, least of all Benjamin, thought to wonder why his ledgers so rarely balanced, or why he took so many solitary walks along the river at dusk, or why, on the nights before the false raiders struck, he was so often absent from camp on unspecified business. It was near the season's midpoint, with the ironwood stacks growing tall along the riverbank ready for the barges south, that Kasha began teaching him her language in earnest, another wager born from an evening dare when he'd bet he could learn 10 Mudborn words before the moon changed, and she'd bet, with visible relish, that he could not. He learned the words for tree, river, blade, fire, home. He learned the word for warrior, and the word for enemy, and the harder, stranger word for peace, which in Mudborn carried an implication of something hard-won and temporary rather than a natural state of things. And one night, sitting close beside her at the fire with the crew long asleep and the forest humming with insects, he asked her, half out of genuine curiosity and half because he liked watching her explain things, what word her people used for someone precious, someone valued above all others. Kasha went very still. "That is not a word given lightly," she said. "I didn't ask you to give it to me. I asked what it was." She studied him a long moment, firelight caught in the gold of her eyes, and then said quietly, "Vareth." "Vareth," Benjamin repeated. "It does not simply mean precious," Kasha said. "Among my people, most matings are arranged, weighed like treaties for the strength of the bloodline or the alliance of clans. To call someone Vareth is to say you have chosen them yourself, freely, against custom, against advice, because your heart demanded it and no other reason would serve. It is not a word spoken often. It is not a word spoken carelessly." She looked at him, something unguarded and almost frightened flickering behind her usual iron composure. "Say it again." Benjamin, who had noticed the exact shape her mouth made around the word, who had spent 3 weeks now learning every inch of her expressions the way he once learned the grain of good timber, said, quite deliberately, "Vareth," placing the emphasis wrong, flattening the vowel she had rounded so carefully, mangling the word just enough that he watched her brow furrow in immediate reflexive correction. "No," she said. "It is Vareth. The stress falls first like this," and she leaned toward him to demonstrate, the way she had corrected his pronunciation a dozen times before over a dozen smaller words, and Benjamin, who had said it wrong entirely on purpose, who had wanted exactly this, her face close to his, her breath warm in the cold night air, did not wait for her to finish the lesson. He closed the distance and kissed her. For one heartbeat she went rigid with surprise, and he thought, with a lurch of pure panic, that he had misjudged everything, the weeks of dares and firelight confessions, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Then her hand came up, not to push him away but to curl into the front of his shirt and pull him closer, and she kissed him back with a hunger that undid every careful, patient thing he had told himself about not hoping for too much. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kasha's forehead rested against his, her eyes closed. "You said it wrong on purpose," she murmured, not quite a question. "Guilty," Benjamin admitted. "You wish to be corrected." "I wished," Benjamin said, "for exactly what just happened." Kasha laughed then, a real laugh, low and surprised, and pulled back just far enough to look at him properly. "You are a cunning man, shipwright, for one who claims to know nothing but wood and rope." "I know when I want something," Benjamin said. "I've just never wanted anything the way I want you. Something in her face softened entirely, the last of her guard falling away in the firelight, and she said, quiet and rough, "Vareth," looking at him as she said it, and this time there was no lesson in it at all, only truth. "Say it to me again," Benjamin said. "Properly, so I know I've learned it right." "You have not earned proper yet," Kasha said, though her mouth was already curving toward his again. "But I am willing to keep teaching you." And this time when their lips met, there was no pretense of a language lesson left between them, only the long, slow unspooling of two people who had spent a month circling something neither had quite dared name. They did not speak of it to the camp, not at first, though Benjamin suspected Garrick and half the crew guessed the shape of things from the way Kasha's patrols now always seemed to route past wherever Benjamin happened to be working, and from the way Benjamin found excuses to walk the boundary line at dusk when her shift began. It was Tam, healed and grateful and possessed of no discretion whatsoever, who let the truth slip loose one evening over the cookfire, and after that there was no pretending. Garrick took it worse than most. "You'll get us all killed," he snarled at Benjamin, cornering him near the timber stacks 2 days after the news had spread. "Company won't stand for it, and her own kind won't either. You think an orc chief wants his warrior mooning over a dock rat with tar under his nails? You're a fool, boy, and you're going to bring trouble down on this whole camp." "The only trouble that's come down on this camp," Benjamin said, keeping his voice level though his hands had curled to fists at his sides, "wore human boots under stolen orc paint, Garrick. Maybe worry about that before you worry about who I love." He had not meant to say the word aloud, not yet, not even to himself in so plain a way, and it startled him as much as it seemed to startle Garrick, who spat and stalked off without further argument, leaving Benjamin alone with the sudden, dizzying knowledge that it was true. The confrontation that truly tested them came a fortnight later, at the treaty market held twice each season on neutral ground at the river ford, where Mudborn traders brought furs and worked iron down from the war camp, and human merchants brought cloth and salt and tools upriver to meet them, all under careful watch from both sides. Benjamin had come with the company wagons to help oversee the ironwood tribute payment, and Kasha had come as warden and escort for her own people's goods, and it should have been a simple, tense, ordinary transaction. It was not. A cluster of human traders from a rival timber concern, men who stood to profit handsomely if the Colborne Company's treaty collapsed and the Thornwood Reach fell open to unregulated logging, had gathered at the market's edge, and one of them, a broad, red-faced man Benjamin did not recognize, began loudly questioning why a Mudborn warrior stood so close to the Colborne wagons, why a human man let an orc handle his company's ledgers, whether the treaty tribute was being padded to line some traitor's pocket. "Everyone knows they can't be trusted," the man announced, to the crowd gathering at the ford, human and orc traders both pausing their business to listen. "Look at her, standing there like she owns the place. Bet she's already got her claws into more than the shipwright's coin purse." The crowd's murmur turned ugly fast, the old prejudice that lived just beneath the treaty's careful surface rising up like a fever, and Benjamin felt the crowd's attention swing toward Kasha with the particular cruelty of people looking for someone to blame for their own fear. Kasha did not flinch. She stood with her spine straight and her chin level, hands loose and ready at her sides, and let the man's words hang in the air until they had made him look small rather than her. "I have stood this treaty line for 6 years," she said, her voice carrying without needing to rise. "In that time I have stopped 4 raids that would have cost your people twice what any tribute has ever cost mine. If you have proof of theft, bring it before the treaty council, human. If you have only fear dressed up as accusation, keep it and get out of my market." "Your market," the red-faced man sneered. "Hear that? Already thinks she's in charge." It might have turned to violence then, the crowd's mood curdling further, hands drifting toward belt knives on both sides of the ford, had Benjamin not stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Kasha and the loudest of the accusers, not because she needed shielding. He knew that even as he did it, but because he needed the crowd to see a human man choose her side plainly, without hesitation, in the open light of day. "I've kept the ledgers on this tribute myself the last 2 markets," Benjamin said, raising his voice enough to carry. "Every weight, every measure. If any man here thinks the count's been padded, I'll open the books to the whole Ford right now, orc and human both, and we'll see whose hands are dirty." He looked the red-faced man dead in the eye. "But I'll wager it isn't hers." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Benjamin's heart hammered against his ribs, certain he had just torn the fragile piece wide open. Then an older Mudborn traitor, a grizzled woman with tusks yellowed by age, laughed, short and sharp, and said something in her own tongue that made several of the orc traders chuckle, and the tension broke like a fever finally lifting. "The shipwright has more spine than the rest of your company put together," she called to the crowd, in accented but clear common speech. "Perhaps that is why our warden looks at him the way she does." The red-faced man, deprived of his audience's outrage, muttered something and withdrew, and the market resumed its business, though Benjamin noticed more than a few eyes, both human and orc, following him and Kasha for the remainder of the day with open, unguarded curiosity rather than suspicion. "You did not need to do that," Kasha said quietly, once they had a moment alone at the wagon's edge, unloading bolts of cloth. "I know," Benjamin said. "Wanted to anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring in her expression. "In my clan," she said slowly, "a warrior does not forget who stood beside them when the crowd turned. It is remembered, it is weighed when the time comes to choose who stands beside them for good." "Is that a warning or a promise?" "With me," Kasha said, allowing herself the smallest smile, "it is rarely only one thing." And she pressed a brief, fierce kiss to the corner of his mouth before turning back to the wagons, leaving him grinning like a fool in front of half the market. It was that same night, back at the logging camp, that Aldous Pike made his first true mistake, one Benjamin would only understand the shape of much later. Pike had watched the confrontation at the ford from the edge of the crowd, watched the treaty's fragile piece nearly crack and then hold, and something in the failure of it seemed to decide him. 2 nights later, deep in the small hours, a fire broke out at the edge of the timber stacks, close enough to the felled ironwood tribute stores to threaten the season's entire harvest, and in the chaos of bucket lines and shouted orders, no one thought to notice that the quartermaster's tent stood empty, its owner absent on business he would not explain when he reappeared, soot-streaked and breathless, an hour before dawn. Kasha noticed. She said nothing of it that night, occupied with organizing the bucket lines with a competence that put Garrick's blustering command to shame, but Benjamin saw her watching Pike across the smoke-hazed camp with an expression he had learned, over the past weeks, meant she was filing something away for later use. "You think it was him," Benjamin said, once the fire was out and the exhausted crew had staggered back to what remained of their sleep. "I think," Kasha said carefully, "that a man who profits from chaos does not always need to swing the torch himself. Sometimes he only needs to know when to look away." "What do? "We watch," she said. "And we do not let him know we are watching." She looked at Benjamin, firelight throwing shadows across the planes of her face, exhaustion and fierce resolve both plain in her eyes. "This treaty has survived worse than one greedy man's schemes. It will survive this too, if we are patient and careful." They were, for a time, both patient and careful, though patience came harder as the season wore on, and the dares between them grew bolder. Less about proving courage to each other and more about the simple, hungry desire to close whatever distance remained. He dared her to spend an entire evening speaking only Mudborn, forcing him to guess her meaning from gesture and tone, and the evening ended with far more gesture than words. She dared him to sleep one night in her own shelter rather than the crowded human tents, an invitation dressed as a challenge that both of them understood for exactly what it was. And though nothing more than sleep occurred that first night, curled together under a single fir with the forest breathing around them. Benjamin woke at dawn with Kasha's arm thrown possessively across his chest, and a peace in his own heart he had not known since before his father drowned. The days grew shorter as autumn crept toward the Thornwood Reach, the ironwood tribute nearly complete, the barges beginning to gather at the river landing for the season's final shipment south. And it was in those last weeks, with the treaty's success so nearly secured, that Aldous Pike's true betrayal finally came to light, and very nearly cost them everything. Benjamin found the ledger by accident, late one evening when Pike had gone to the river landing to oversee the barge loading, and left his tent flap carelessly unlatched in his haste. Benjamin had gone looking for a manifest to settle a dispute over cloth weights, nothing more sinister than that, and instead found, tucked beneath a false bottom in Pike's strongbox, a second set of accounts entirely, recording payments made not to the Mudborn clan for tribute, but to a mercenary captain named Boris Vane, payments that matched, almost to the day, the dates of every false raid the camp had suffered that season. His hands were shaking when he brought the ledger to Kasha's shelter that same night. "He's been paying raiders to attack us," Benjamin said, laying the pages out before her by lamplight. "Dressed as your people, so the blame would fall on the Mudborn and break the treaty. And look here, there's a final payment scheduled, 3 days from now, the night the last barge is meant to leave. He's planning something bigger than a skirmish, Kasha. He's planning to burn the whole harvest and blame it on your clan so thoroughly the Treaty Council will have no choice but to end it." Kasha's face had gone hard and still as stone as she read, and when she finished, she looked up at him with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that might have been fear. "If the treaty falls, it will not simply mean the loss of a season's timber, Benjamin. It will mean war returns to this border. My people, your people, both bleeding again for another man's coin." "Then we stop him," Benjamin said. "Tonight, before he knows we've found this." But Aldous Pike, whatever else he was not a careless man for long, and he returned to his tent within the hour to find the false bottom of his strongbox disturbed and the ledger gone. By the time Kasha and Benjamin had gathered enough of the camp's trusted hands to move against him, Pike had already fled into the deep forest, and worse, had sent some signal ahead of him, for the following night, with the moon barely a sliver above the tree line, Boris Vane's mercenaries came for the timber camp in force. They came from 3 sides at once, torches lit, arrows already nocked, and this time there was no ambiguity about who they meant to be blamed for it, for they wore no orc paint at all, only the plain leathers of hired killers who no longer cared whether the treaty survived, only that Pike's coin, and whatever prize Vane sought beyond it, changed hands before dawn. "They mean to burn the ironwood stacks and take the camp's strongbox in the chaos," Kasha said grimly, watching the torchlight multiply along the tree line from the rise above camp, where she and Benjamin had gone to scout the moment the alarm bell rang. "And with the Colborne quartermaster already fled and the treaty broken in the confusion, there will be no one left who can say honestly what happened here tonight." "Then we make sure someone survives who can," Benjamin said. What followed was the worst hour of Benjamin Turner's life, and also, strange as it would seem to him later, one of the most vivid, for terror had a way of making every detail unbearably sharp. The crackle of the first ironwood stack catching flame, the screams of the crew scrambling for the river, the whistle of arrows finding their marks in canvas and wood and twice in flesh. Kasha fought like something out of the old war stories, cutting a path through the mercenaries with a ferocity that left Benjamin both terrified for her and fiercely, helplessly proud. But even she could not be everywhere, and the mercenaries, well paid and well organized, had clearly planned for exactly this kind of resistance. "They're cutting off the river path," Kasha shouted over the roar of the burning stacks, dragging Benjamin back from an arrow that would have taken him through the throat. "Vane means to trap the whole camp between the fire and the water." "There's a game trail," Benjamin said, memory of 100 small dares and long walks through the reach suddenly, desperately useful. Kasha, the ridge trail, the one you showed me the first week above the gorge. It comes out past the ford. If we can get the crew moving that way, it is narrow. If they follow us onto it in force, we will have no room to fight. Then we don't fight, Benjamin said. We run and we make sure everyone gets out. There was no time to argue further. Kasha turned, bellowing orders in a mix of common speech and Mudborn that scattered the panicked crew into something resembling order. And together, they drove the surviving hands of the Colborne camp toward the ridge trail, while behind them the ironwood stacks burned like a beacon visible for miles. And Bora's Vane's mercenaries, realizing their prey was slipping the trap, came howling after them with torches and blades both. The ridge trail was exactly as narrow as Kasha had warned, a knife-edge path along the lip of a gorge with the river churning black and cold 50 feet below, and they ran it in the dark with fire at their backs and arrows hissing past on every side, hunters closing from behind, and Benjamin realized with a lurch of horror from ahead as well, where a second group of Vane's men had circled to cut off their escape at the trail's far end. Kasha! He shouted, as the pincer became clear, torchlight blooming ahead of them as well as behind. They've got both ends. I see it, Kasha snarled, and without another word she caught Benjamin by the arm and hauled him, along with 2 of the nearest crewmen, off the main trail entirely, down a near-vertical deer track toward the gorge's rim that Benjamin would never in 100 years have found or trusted on his own. This drops straight into the river, he said, staring down at the black water rushing far below, arrows still whistling overhead as the mercenaries realized their quarry had scattered and turned their attention downward. It does, Kasha agreed, already stripping the crewmen of anything that would weigh them down. And the current runs to the ford, and the ford is inside Mudborn patrol range, where Vane's men will not dare follow past the boundary stones, coin or no coin. It is that or the blades behind us, shipwright. Choose quickly. An arrow struck the rock face inches from Benjamin's head, close enough that stone fragments stung his cheek, and the decision in the end made itself. He caught Kasha's hand, felt her fingers close hard and sure around his, and together, with the 2 frightened crewmen scrambling behind them, they leapt from the gorge's rim into the black rushing water below, the mercenaries' furious shouts and the roar of the burning camp fading above them into the cold, consuming dark. The river took them hard, spinning and driving them downstream faster than Benjamin could think, and for a long, terrifying stretch, there was nothing in the world but cold and current and the desperate, animal need to keep his head above the surface. He lost his grip on Kasha's hand almost immediately, lost sight of the 2 crewmen entirely, and it was only sheer stubborn will that kept him swimming toward what he prayed was the nearer bank, rather than simply being carried under. He came ashore, finally, gasping and shaking, on a gravel bar he did not recognize, and it was several endless heartbeats of raw panic before he heard, over the rush of the water, a voice calling his name, and turned to see Kasha wading out of the shallows toward him, soaked and furious and utterly, gloriously alive. Benjamin, she said, and then she had crossed the last of the distance between them and pulled him into her arms with a fierceness that stole what little breath the river had left him, her whole body shaking, whether from cold or terror or relief he could not tell and did not care. I thought the current had taken you under. Still here, he managed, muffled against her shoulder. Barely. The others made the bank a half-mile downstream, Kasha said, pulling back just far enough to look at him, her hands framing his face with a tenderness that seemed strange still, against the memory of her cutting through mercenaries an hour before. I found them before I found you. I feared she stopped, jaw working, and Benjamin understood, watching her, that Kasha Mudborn, who feared nothing that walked on 2 legs or 4, had spent the worst minutes of her own life believing the river had taken him from her. I'm here, he said again, softer this time, cupping her face in return, taking in the details of her in the gray light before dawn, hair plastered dark against her skull, eyes wide and bright and afraid in a way he had never seen them before. "I'm here, Kasha." "We're both here." She kissed him then, hard and desperate and salt-tasting, whether from the river or from tears he did not ask, and when they finally broke apart she rested her forehead against his, breathing hard. "Do not do that to me again," she said, half command and half plea. "I'll do my absolute best," Benjamin said, "though I'd point out you're the one who jumped off a cliff first." "I had a plan," Kasha said with as much dignity as a soaking wet, shivering woman could muster. "Did the plan involve nearly drowning?" "The plan involved not being shot," she said. "Drowning was an acceptable risk." Despite everything, despite the cold and the exhaustion and the smoke still visible on the horizon where the timber camp burned, Benjamin found himself laughing, and after a startled moment Kasha laughed with him, both of them half hysterical with relief, clinging to each other on the gravel bar as the sky slowly lightened toward dawn. They found the two surviving crewmen not long after, and together the small, battered group made their way along the riverbank toward the treaty ford, where Kasha's own warband, alerted by scouts who had seen the fire, met them within the hour. What remained of the Colborne logging camp gathered there through the following days, shaken but largely alive, thanks in no small part to the Ridge Trail escape that would be told and retold along both sides of the border for years afterward. And it was there, at the treaty ford, that the last of the story's threads were finally drawn tight. Bora's vein, deprived of his ambush, and his coin both once word of the burning camp reached the wider region, was taken within the week by a joint patrol of Mudborn warriors and Colborne Company guards, an unprecedented cooperation born entirely of the previous night's shared danger. Aldous Pike was found 2 days after that, hiding in a river town downstream, the second ledger and Benjamin's testimony enough to see him bound over to the Treaty Council for judgment. His years of careful embezzlement and betrayal laid bare before both human and Mudborn representatives in a hearing that, rather than breaking the treaty as he had intended, only strengthened it, for it proved beyond doubt that the false raids of the season had never once been the Mudborn clan's doing. "You realize," Kasha said, some days later as they stood together on the ridge above the ruined camp watching Colborne Company men and Mudborn laborers work side by side to clear the fire damage and begin rebuilding, "that you have made yourself rather famous among my people. The shipwright who led a warband's warden off a cliff into a river and survived to complain about it." "I didn't lead anyone anywhere," Benjamin protested. "You're the one who grabbed my hand." "And you are the one who found the trail in the first place," Kasha said. "My scouts have taken to calling you Ashkivar Dienmer. It does not translate cleanly. Something near to fool who walks with fortune." "I'll take it," Benjamin said. "Better than some of the names I've been called." Kasha turned to look at him then, and something in her expression had shifted since the night of the fire, some final wall finally, fully down. "I spoke with my clan chief," she said, "and with the elders after the Treaty Council's hearing concluded. There is a rite among my people, Benjamin, older than the treaty itself. It is not spoken of lightly, and it is rarely offered to one who is not Mudborn." "What kind of rite?" "A claiming," Kasha said. "When a warrior of our clan finds one they would choose freely, above custom, above the council of elders, above every arrangement that might be made for them instead, they may claim that person before witnesses, binding themselves by the old words rather than by any treaty or contract." She held his gaze, steady despite the vulnerability plain beneath it. "It is not done for convenience, Benjamin Turner. It is not done for alliance or advantage. It is done only for love, and only once, for it cannot be undone once spoken." Benjamin's heart was hammering hard enough he was certain she could hear it. "Are you asking me something, Kasha?" "I am telling you," she said, "that I intend to perform this rite at the season's final gathering, before my clan and before whatever of your own people wish to stand witness. I am telling you this now so that you have time to decide whether you wish to be claimed, or whether you wish to return to your ships and your salt water and forget this season ever happened." "I've never wanted to forget anything less in my life," Benjamin said, closing the distance between them, taking her hands in his. Kasha Mudborn. I came into these woods to buy timber for hulls I'll probably never see finished, and I found you instead, and I would trade every plank of ironwood in this whole forest before I'd trade one single day of the last season with you. If your people have a right for choosing someone freely, above every sensible reason not to, then yes. 1,000 times yes. Claim me. Her eyes were bright, and for once she did not try to hide it, leaning her forehead against his the way she had on the gravel bar after the river, though this time there was no fear left in it at all, only a fierce, settled joy. Say the word again, she murmured. Properly this time. You have had a season to learn it. Benjamin smiled against her skin. Vareth, he said, stress falling exactly where she had taught him, the vowel rounded just so. Better, Kasha said, and kissed him to prove it, slow and certain, a promise rather than a correction this time. The claiming was held 3 weeks later, at the turning of the season, on the wide grassy shoulder of land, where the treaty ford met the edge of the Thornwood Reach. Neutral ground chosen, deliberately, so that both peoples might stand witness together for the first time in the treaty's long history to something other than trade and tribute. Lanterns and torches ringed the gathering as dusk fell, human faces from the rebuilt logging camp mixed among the gathered ranks of the Mudborn clan, Garrick himself standing somewhat awkwardly near the front, having grudgingly admitted, in the aftermath of the fire, that he owed Kasha Mudborn a debt he could not easily repay, and old traders from the market ford, including the tusked woman who had laughed away the crowd's ugliness that day, standing with clear satisfaction among the Mudborn ranks. Benjamin stood at the center of the gathered witnesses in the best clothes he owned, borrowed boots polished, hands still faintly scarred from a season of ropes and axes, and one memorable leap into a gorge river, his heart hammering so hard he was certain everyone present could hear it. Across from him, Kasha Mudborn wore no armor for the first time since he had known her, only a simple, finely worked leather dress the deep green of the forest itself, her hair unbound and loose down her back, and she had never, in all the months he had known her, looked more like exactly what she was, a warrior utterly unafraid to be seen wanting something for herself. The clan chief, an old, broad-shouldered orc named Thren Ashfall, spoke first, his voice carrying easily over the assembled crowd, explaining in both common speech and Mudborn, for the benefit of every witness present, the weight and history of the rite about to be performed, that it had not been offered to an outsider in 3 generations, that it bound not by custom or contract, but by the plain, unbreakable word of the one who knelt. Then Kasha Mudborn, warrior of the Mudborn clan, warden of the treaty border, the woman who had once put her boot on a raider's chest without a flicker of fear, knelt before Benjamin Turner on the grass of the treaty ford, before her clan and before his people both, and took his hands in hers. I am Kasha, daughter of Iasa Mudborn, warden of this border, she said, her voice steady and clear enough to carry to every witness gathered. I have led warriors into battle and stood alone against raiders in the dark, and I have never in my life knelt for anything I did not choose to kneel for. She looked up at him, gold eyes bright with unhidden feeling. I choose this. I choose you, Benjamin Turner, shipwright of Saltmore Cove, not for treaty, not for alliance, not for any reason but that my heart demanded it the day you did not run from arrows to save a man you barely knew. You are Vareth, chosen, mine if you will have me for as long as I draw breath. Benjamin, who had faced down flames and arrows in a black rushing river this same season, found his voice shaking far more now than it had in any of those moments. I will have you, he said. Kasha Mudborn, I came into these woods a man nobody had ever chosen first for anything, and you chose me anyway, again and again, every single day since. I don't have some old right to offer you back. I've only got the truth, which is that I love you, and I intend to keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life, whether that's here in these woods or back on the coast or anywhere else the tide happens to carry us. Kasha rose then, and the old chief spoke the final binding words in Mudborn, words Benjamin had learned only in fragments but understood well enough by their weight and cadence. And when the words were finished, Kasha did not wait for further ceremony. She pulled Benjamin into her arms and kissed him before the entire gathered crowd, human and orc alike. And the cheer that rose from both sides of the treaty ford in that moment was louder and warmer than any Benjamin had heard in all his years at Saltmore Cove. A sound that seemed, for just that one bright evening, to erase every old line of prejudice and suspicion that had ever stood between their two peoples. Garrick, of all people, was the one who found Benjamin afterward, thrusting a rough hand out to shake. "Didn't think much of this when it started," he admitted gruffly. "Reckon I was wrong about more than one thing this season." He nodded toward Kasha, who stood nearby accepting the congratulations of her clan with the particular fierce joy of a woman who had won something she had never expected to want. "Take care of her, boy, and let her take care of you. Seems like the two of you have got the way of it." "Planning on it," Benjamin said, and found he meant it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life. They stayed at the treaty ford long into the night, long after the lanterns burned low and the last of the well-wishers drifted toward their own fires, Kasha's hand never far from his, her shoulder warm against his side. When at last they walked together back toward the rebuilt camp, the thornwood reached dark and vast around them, alive with the small sounds of a forest settling into autumn. Benjamin found himself thinking of the arrow that had missed his ear on the very first day, of how close the whole story had come to never happening at all, and how strange and fortunate a thing it was that a season of dares and firelight and one deliberately mispronounced word had led him here, chosen, wanted. No longer a man nobody thought to seek out first. "What happens now?" he asked as they reached the edge of camp, the fires banked low, the ironwood stacks, rebuilt and taller than before, standing black and solid against the stars. "Now," Kasha said, drawing him close, her voice warm against his ear, "you keep your promise, shipwright. You keep choosing me, and I will keep choosing you every day for as long as the tide allows." She pulled back just enough to look at him, gold eyes soft in the dying firelight. "Vareth," she said again, and this time it was neither lesson nor correction, only the simple, settled truth of a word finally, fully earned. "Vareth," Benjamin echoed perfectly, and kissed her beneath the ironwood trees, at the edge of a border that no longer felt like an edge at all, but like the beginning of everything he had ever quietly hoped, without daring to say so, that his life might someday become.